Tragedy and Hope, the Far East to World War One, the collapse of China to 1920, the destruction of traditional Chinese culture under the impact of Western civilization was considerably later than the similar destruction of Indian culture by Europeans. This delay arose from the fact that European pressure on India was applied fairly steadily from the early 16th century, while in the Far East, in Japan even more completely than in China, this pressure was relaxed from the early 17th century for almost 200 years, to 1794 in the case of China, and to 1854 in the case of Japan. As a result, we can see the process by which European culture was able to destroy the traditional native cultures of Asia more clearly in China than almost anywhere else. The traditional culture of China, as elsewhere in Asia, consisted of a military and bureaucratic hierarchy, superimposed on a great mass of hard-working peasantry. It is customary in studying the subject to divide this hierarchy into three levels. Politically, these three levels consisted of the imperial authority at the top, an enormous hierarchy of imperial and provincial officials in the middle, and the myriad of semi-patriarchal, semi-democratic local villages at the bottom. Socially, this hierarchy was similarly divided into the ruling class, the gentry, and the peasants. And economically, there was a parallel division, the uppermost group deriving its incomes as tribute and taxes from its possession of military and political power, while the middle group derived its incomes from economic sources as interests on loans, rents from lands, and the profits of commercial enterprise, as well as from the salaries, draft, and other emoluments arising from his middle group's control of the bureaucracy. At the bottom, the peasantry, which was the only really productive group of society, derived its incomes from the sweat of its collective brows, and had to survive on what was left to it after a substantial fraction of its products had gone to the two higher groups in the form of rents, taxes, interest, customary bribes called squeeze, and excessive profits on such purchased necessities of life as salt, iron, or opium. Although the peasants were clearly an exploited group in the traditional society of China, this exploitation was impersonal and traditional, and thus more easily borne than it had been personal, personal or arbitrary. In the course of time, a workable system of customary relationships had come into existence among the three levels of society. Each group knew its established relationships with the others and used these relationships to avoid any sudden or excessive pressures which might disrupt the established patterns of society. The political and military force of the imperial regime rarely impinged directly on the peasantry, since the bureaucracy intervened between them as a protecting buffer. This buffer followed a pattern of deliberate amorphous inefficiency, so that the military and political force from above had been diffused, dispersed, and blunted by the time it reached down to the peasant villages. The bureaucracy followed this pattern because it recognized that the peasantry was the source of its incomes, and it had no desire to create such discontent as would jeopardize the productive process or the payment of rents, taxes, and interests on which it lived. Furthermore, the inefficiency of the system was both customary and deliberate, since it allowed a large proportion of the wealth which was being drained from the peasantry to be diverted and diffused among the middle class or gentry before the remnants of it reached the imperial group at the top. This imperial group, in its turn, had to accept this system of inefficiency and diversion of incomes and its own basic remoteness from the peasantry because of the great size of China, the ineffectiveness of its systems of transportation and communications, and the impossibility of keeping records of population or of incomes and taxes except through the indirect mediation of the bureaucracy. The semi-autonomous position of the bureaucracy depended to a considerable extent on the fact that the Chinese system of writing was so cumbersome, so inefficient, and so difficult to learn that the central government could not possibly have kept any records or have administered tax collection, public order, or justice except through a bureaucracy of trained experts. This bureaucracy was recruited from the gentry because the complex systems of writing, of law, and of administrative traditions could be mastered only by a group possessing leisure based on unearned incomes. To be sure, in time, the training for this bureaucracy and for the examinations admitting to it became quite unrealistic, consisting largely of memorizing of ancient literary texts for examination purposes rather than for any cultural or administrative ends. This was not so bad as it sounds, for many of the memorized texts contained a good deal of ancient wisdom with an ethical or practical this was not, and the possession of this store of knowledge engendered in its possessors a respect for moderation and for tradition which was just what the system required. No one regretted that the system of education and of examinations leading to the bureaucracy did not engender a thirst for efficiency, because efficiency was not a quality which anyone desired. The bureaucracy itself did not desire efficiency because this would have reduced its ability to divert the funds flowing upward from the peasantry. The peasantry surely did not want any increase in efficiency, which would have led to an increase in pressure on it and would have made it less easy to blunt or to avoid the impact of imperial power. The imperial power itself had little desire for any increased efficiency in its bureaucracy, since this might have led to increased independence on the part of the bureaucracy. So long as the imperial superstructure of Chinese society obtained its share of the wealth flowing upward from the peasantry, it was satisfied. The share of this wealth which the imperial group obtained was very large in absolute figures, although proportionately it was only a small part of the total amount which left the peasant class, the larger part being diverted by the gentry and bureaucracy on its upward flow. The exploitative nature of this three-class social system was alleviated, as we have seen, by inefficiency, by traditional moderation and accepted ethical ideas, by a sense of social interdependence, and by the power of traditional law and custom, which protected the ordinary peasant from arbitrary treatment or the direct impact of force. Most important of all, perhaps, the system was alleviated by the existence of careers open to talent. China never became organized into hereditary groups or castes, by being in this respect like England and quite unlike India. The way was open to the top in Chinese society, not for any individual peasant in his own lifetime, but to any individual peasant family over a period of several generations. Thus an individual's position in society depended not on the efforts of his own youth, but on the efforts of his father and grandfather. If a Chinese peasant was diligent, shrewd, and lucky, he could expect to accumulate some small surplus beyond the subsistence of his own family, and the drain to the upper classes. This surplus could be invested in activities such as iron making, opium selling, lumber or fuel selling, pig trading, and such. The profits from these activities could then be invested in small bits of land to be rented out to less fortunate peasants or in loans to other peasants. If times remained good, the owner of the surpluses began to receive rents and interest from his neighbors. If times became bad, he still had his land or could take over his debtor's land as forfeited collateral on his loan. In good times or bad, the growth of population in China kept the demand for land high, and peasants were able to rise in the social scale from peasantry to gentry by slowly expanding their legal claims over land. Once in the gentry, one's children or grandchildren could be educated to pass the bureaucratic examinations and be admitted to the group of mandarins. A family which had a member or two in this group gained access to the whole system of squeeze and of bureaucratic diversion of income flows, so that the family as a whole could continue to rise in the social and economic structure. Eventually, some member of the family might move into the imperial center from the provincial level on which this rise began, and might even gain access to the imperial ruling group itself. In these higher levels of the social structure, many families were able to maintain a position for generations, but in general there was a steady, if slow, circulation of the elite, most families remaining in a high social position for only a couple of generations, after about 3 generations of climb, to be followed by a couple of generations of decline. Thus the old American saying that it took only 3 generations from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves would in the old China have to be extended to allow about 6 or 7 generations from the rice paddy's drudgery back to the rice paddy again. But the hope of such a rise contributed much to increase individual diligence and family solidarity and to reduce peasant discontent. Only in the late 19th and early 20th century did peasants in China come to regard their positions as so hopeless that violence became preferable to diligence or conformity. This change arose from the fact that, as we shall see, the impact of Western culture in China did in fact make the peasant's position economically hopeless. In traditional Chinese society, the bureaucrats recruited through examinations from the gentry class were called mandarins. They became, for all practical purposes, the dominant element in Chinese society. Since their social and economic position did not rest on political or military power, but on traditions, legal structure, social stability, accepted ethical teachings, and the rights of property, this middle-level group gave Chinese society a powerful traditionalist orientation. Respect for old traditions, for the accepted modes of thought and action, for the ancestors in society and religion, and for the father and the family, became the salient characteristics of Chinese society. That this society was a complex network of vested interests was unprogressive and was shot through with corruption was no more objectionable to the average Chinese on any level than the fact that it was also shot through with inefficiency. These things became objectionable only when Chinese society came directly in contact with European culture during the 19th century. As these two societies collided, inefficiency, unprogressiveness, corruption, and the whole nexus of vested interests and traditions which constituted Chinese society was unable to survive in contact with the efficiency, the progressiveness, and the instruments of penetration and domination of Europeans. A system could not hope to survive which could not provide itself with firearms in large quantities, or which mass armies of loyal soldiers to use such weapons, a system which could not increase its taxes or its output of wealth, or which could not keep track of its own population or its own incomes by effective records, or which had no effective methods of communication and transportation over an area of 3.5 million square miles. The society of the West, which began to impinge on China about 18,000, was powerful, efficient, and progressive. It had no respect for the corruption, the traditions, the property rights, the family solidarity, or the ethical moderation of traditional Chinese society. As the weapons of the West, along with its efficient methods of sanitation, of writing, of transportation and communications, of individual self-interest, and of corrosive intellectual rationalism, came into contact with Chinese society, they began to dissolve it. On the one hand, Chinese society was too weak to defend itself against the West. When it tried to do so, as in the Opium Wars and other struggles of 1841 to 1861, or in the Boxer Uprising of 1900, such Chinese resistance to European penetration was crushed by the armaments of the Western powers, and all kinds of concessions to these powers were imposed on China. Until 1841, Canton was the only port allowed for foreign imports, and opium was illegal. As a consequence of Chinese destruction of illegal Indian opium and the commercial exactions of Cantonese authorities, Britain imposed on China the treaties of Nanking (1842) and of Tientsin (1858). These forced China to cede Hong Kong to Britain and to open 16 ports to foreign trade, to impose a uniform import tariff of no more than 5%, to pay an indemnity of about $100 million, to permit foreign legations in Peking, to allow a British official to act as head of the Chinese Customs Service, and to legalize the import of opium. Other agreements were imposed by which China lost various fringe areas such as Burma to Britain, Indochina to France, Formosa and the Pescadores to Japan, and Macau to Portugal, while other areas were taken or on leases of various durations, from 25 to 99 years. In this way, Germany took Kiao Chau, Russia took southern Liaotung, including Port Arthur, France took Guangzhou, and Britain took Kowloon and Weihawei. In this same period, various powers imposed on China a system of extraterritorial courts, under which foreigners in judicial cases could not be tried in Chinese courts or under Chinese law. The political impact of Western civilization on China, great as it was overshadowed by the economic impact. We have already indicated that China was a largely agrarian country. Years of cultivation and the slow growth of population had given rise to a relentless pressure on the soil and to a destructive exploitation of its vegetative resources. Most of the country was deforested, resulting in shortage of fuel, rapid runoff of precipitation, constant danger of floods, and large-scale erosion of the soil. Cultivation has been extended to remote valleys and up the slopes of hills by population pressures, with a great increase in the same destructive consequences, in spite of the fact that many slopes were rebuilt in terraces. The fact that the southern portion of the country depended on rice cultivation created many problems, since this crop, of relatively low nutritive value, required great expenditure of labor, transplanting and weeding, under conditions which were destructive of good health. Long periods of waiting in rice paddies exposed most peasants to various kinds of joint diseases, and to waterborne infections such as malaria or parasitical flukes.